And now we're going to move into a time of prayer and meditation. If you've not been with us for a while or are brand new, meditation and prayer are key practices for us in Unity. Unity was started as a result of prayer and healing that resulted from prayer. So it's a very important practice to us. Our prayer and meditation segment begins with chanting, and throughout our time together, we practice the technique of mindfulness, where we are aware of the breath as we take it into the body and aware of the breath as we let it go. We also do a little bit of the heart math lock-in technique, and I'll guide you through each of the aspects of our meditation. Be patient with yourself. If you're new to this as a practice, it takes a while for most of us before the mind learns to quiet down some, but with practice we do get better at it. So make sure your phones are turned off, especially if you've just come in, and now go ahead and find a comfortable position in your chair. It is beneficial to sit with your back nice and straight and with your legs uncrossed, your feet flat on the floor. That just helps your body to be in a position where it doesn't get in the way of being able to meditate. And then we'll start with the technique I first learned from Thich Nhat Hanh. It's 3 cleansing breaths. I'll tell you what that is, and then we'll do it together. So the 3 cleansing breaths are taking a breath in, being aware of the breath, letting the breath go, and then the very first exhalation, we practice the feeling of letting go. Then with the second cycle, the second breath in, the second breath out, we practice the feeling of being right here, letting our bodies, ourselves really be in this space. And then with the third conscious breath in and out, we practice the feeling of opening up, opening up. All right, so make sure you feel comfortable in your chair. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and close your eyes. And go ahead and take a nice deep breath in. And as you let that breath go, practice feeling, letting go. And another deep and conscious breath in. And as you let that breath go, practice the feeling, being here. And a third deep breath in. And as you let that breath go, practice the feeling, opening up. And so continue to be aware of each breath. Letting go. Being here. Opening up. Steady attention on the breath. Letting go. Being here. Opening up.
Bodhisattva
As the room becomes a bit more quiet, allow yourself to continue to move into that very quiet, very still and peaceful state. Still aware of each breath. The gentle rise and fall of the chest. Mind becoming more quiet and still. When Jesus gave us instructions for prayer and meditation, he said we were to pray to our Father who sees in secret. We were to go into the closet and shut the door and there pray. And of course, he was referring to closing the door to the concerns of the outer world and spending time in that still, quiet, peaceful place. that state of being undisturbed by anything external. To help move even deeper into that state, allow your attention to drop into the area of the heart, the center of your chest. Imagining each mindful breath moving in and through the heart. Quiet mind. Relaxed body. Open heart. Let this time in quiet and stillness be time that feeds your spirit and soul. Let it be a time that births clarity and insight. A time of healing. So continue to be aware of each mindful breath, imagining the breath is moving in and through the heart. As we practice together for the next few minutes in complete silence and complete stillness, heart-focused attention, mindful of each breath in, each breath out. As you hear the music filling the room once again, allow your attention to begin to rise to the surface, preparing to bring your time of meditation and prayer to a close. Taking just a moment to feel grateful for being in community with one another and sharing time and stillness and quiet, the richness of that. So we just say, thank you, Spirit. Thank you, Spirit. And so it is. Amen and amen. We're beginning a series this month in an exploration of this book, Finding Yourself in Transition, Using Life's Changes for Spiritual Awakening. I particularly like that last part, using life's changes for spiritual awakening. Specifically this morning, we're going to take a look at the idea of changes and transitions. This book was written by my classmate, Reverend Bob Brume. And I want to begin by reading a good chunk of the preface of the book because it really sets the framework for what he's writing about and why he is writing. Several years ago, I dreamed that I was living in this particular house. It was a house of my childhood, the house in which I had lived for 16 years. In this dream, my wife and I and our 4 children were inside the house enjoying one another's company. Suddenly, the house began to shake. The walls began to cave in, the ceiling started to fall, and I panicked. I shouted, I ran out, everyone get out quickly. I ran out the front door as fast as I could. The ground beneath my feet was shaking violently. I turned to look behind me, and as I did, I saw the house collapse into a pile of rubble. Everyone inside was killed. Everything in it was destroyed. I was shaken to the very depths of my being. And then, as I looked up at the night sky, I saw millions of crystal stars looking down upon me. Suddenly, I felt at one with all that my eyes could see. In that instant, I experienced simultaneously bottomless grief and infinite joy. I then knew that these were but opposite sides of the same coin. I sensed the death of my old life and the birth of a new one. This was the beginning of my transition. 3 years later, my 25-year marriage had come to an end. My work as a minister of a Unity church was over. My life was in chaos. I was nearly bankrupt. My sense of identity was demolished. The pain and confusion felt overwhelming. I stood in shock looking at the rubble that was once my life. At age 45, I had felt as if my life was over. It was. The new life that has emerged is not the same as the old one. Out of the ashes of the former life, a new birth has taken place. Indeed, God was in charge. Yet, in the midst of my darkness, I could not see that. I had no maps, no guidelines, no history upon which I could draw in order to understand my experience. I have since encountered many other persons struggling with the pain and uncertainty of transition. I saw that they, like myself, were totally unprepared for the impact that change would have on their lives. I realized that our culture, in spite of the enormous changes that have occurred since the mid-60s, offers us little in the way of help in coping with change. The world of my youth was a world where change was simply not acknowledged. And if the change was so great that it must be acknowledged, then it was treated as a tragedy from which we must recover as quickly as possible so that we could return to lives of normalcy. Such was the only model for change that I knew. This book, Our Time Together, has 2 objectives. One is to offer an alternative model for navigating one's way through life's transitions, to provide somewhat of a map for the journey. And a second, and perhaps more important objective, is to help you discover that a major life transition is an opportunity for transformation, a transformation into an entirely new life. That was quite a dream that Bob had, and I'm sure we could relate to the feelings of fear and shock and sadness at such a dream, and then to watch one's life as one had once known it begin to completely crumble and fall apart had to have been, was a very big change for him that eventually led into transition and ultimately into transformation. As I begin, I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that change and transition are synonymous? Are change and transition the same thing? Okay, most of you are saying no. They're not the same. You're right. Change and transition are not the same things. How are they different? Beautiful. I hear several things, but I heard change is inevitable, transition is a choice. Did you read my notes? Change is inevitable. Transition is not inevitable. Change is inevitable. Would you not say that we are living in a time of more change than any other generation before us? Yeah. Do you think that's going to change? I don't think so either. I think it's going to happen more and more and more. And we can resist it, resent it, fight it, ignore it all we want. But it's not going to change the inevitability and the acceleration of the change that is happening all around us. So change is inevitable, but transition is not. Transition is a choice, and even more than a choice, it is a process. Change, when you think about it, is really an event. We have all sorts of events that happen in our lives personally that bring about change. Our companies might change their structure or their hiring practices or their promotion practices. We have changes that happen. We get married, we leave home, we divorce, a loved one moves away, all sorts of changes that exist in a moment in time. Transition, however, is a process that happens as a result of what we do with that event, how it lives inside of us, how we respond to it, and whether we emerge from it somehow new and different because of it. Remember, the idea is that as spiritual beings, we can look at and interact with any change and have it be a catalyst for our spiritual awakening. We talk, especially in metaphysical circles, in spiritual circles, we talk about the desire to be spiritually awake. For most of us, that process of becoming and staying more consistently spiritually awake is usually preceded by some cosmic 2x4s across the side of the head, right? I mean, if you read the stories, for example, of Byron Katie's experience of awakening, or you read the story of Adyashanti's experience of awakening, or Eckhart Tolle's experience of awakening, there was a change, a something that shook their ground of being in such a way that everything was different, and they had to process and be with those changes in a very different way, to interact with them in such a way that the very ground beneath them that was no longer stable in the way that it once was a ground that gave birth to something new, trying to find its way in and through them. Despite the inevitability of change, have you noticed that we haven't necessarily gotten really, really, really good at dealing with it yet? Yeah. Just listen to conversations around you, family conversations or conversations at work when things are changed. Even listen to conversations around here when things are changed. You can clap. we haven't necessarily gotten as good at dealing with change as I think we really need to. When we can get better at dealing with it, we will feel more joyful. We will feel more alive. We will feel more free. I like this quote from Freya Stark. The most ominous of fallacies, the belief that things can be kept static by inaction. The belief that things can be kept static by inaction. Deep and sudden change, the kind of change that Bob Brume wrote about in his preface, the kinds of deep and sudden changes that some of us in this room have experienced. The sudden death of a loved one through suicide or an accident, the demise of our financial stability, bad news regarding our health, all sorts of sudden and traumatic changes are the very kind that are grist for the mill for our transition and our transformation. But they are tough. They are very tough because they reorient everything within us, and that's why it shakes us to our core. That's what I was talking about if you were with us last week when I talked about what it is to be in the dark night of the soul. So we're going to take a little bit of a look and try to understand what this process of change and transition is all about, and how transition is a process and not an event. Change is an event. So every kind of change, in a way, is an experience of death. Would you not agree? It is a dying of the old that something new and hopefully better can emerge. Jesus said to his disciples, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." I'm going to say that again, and I want to unpack it because it's a really rich teaching mystically and metaphysically. He said, unless a grain of wheat, think of a tiny little grain of wheat, falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. So he's saying unless it's planted, if it's just left out, it remains alone. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, if it is in the ground, if it dies, it bears much fruit. What does he mean, if it dies? When that grain of sand is in the ground, on one hand, it is going to experience a death. It's going to experience a death of its former self. The shell is going to be forced open by the implicit intelligent order or blueprint within that grain of wheat. It's going to be forced open, and in its cracking its shell, in its being forced open, it will begin to grow in such a way that it multiplies. But the amount of force, the amount of pressure, the amount of what's going on in that breaking open, I bet doesn't feel too good. Can you relate to that seed at all? Any of those significant changes in your life that just felt like they were ripping you apart? We can look at our world today right now. We are seeing evidence of such a need to evolve consciously. We are seeing evidence of old systems absolutely having to die so that something new, something right, something holy, something just, something loving, something kind can be birthed. But in that process, there is usually an awful lot of breaking down and breaking apart and falling apart, whether we're talking about systems and societies or we're talking about individuals. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church in Corinth, used the statement, "I die daily." He wasn't speaking of a physical death. He was speaking of dying of old ways of being that no longer serve. And so change, whatever kinds of changes are happening in our lives, are the events that can catapult us into a process of transition that leads to transformation. Emphasis on the word process. We don't tend to be too good with process as a culture. We tend to value expediency so much so that we fail to understand that process takes time. process is an unfolding. And have you noticed that when you mess with the natural unfolding of something, you usually mess it up royally? Right? There is an implicit order, an intelligent blueprint, if you will, within every living organism, including us. Implicit in an acorn is a blueprint, a perfect blueprint. Implicit in that acorn is a blueprint that allows that acorn to break apart, to unfold, and to become what? An oak tree. In perfect order. Implicit in the pit of a peach is the perfect order for that peach to unfold and become a beautiful tree. What happens when we mess with those things? Implicit in the order of a chrysalis is a perfect blueprint for that chrysalis to emerge and become a butterfly. But what happens when we interfere with that process because we want to speed that process up because it's not happening as quickly as we want it to, and so we get in there to speed it up? What happens to the chrysalis? It dies. It dies. Why? Because it didn't develop the strength it needed to break through that membrane and strip the whatever the substance is that's on its wings as it's trying to emerge. What happens when we mess with the process of that peach? Notice I changed it from a tomato to a peach. If you've been with me, you know I love to use this one. What happens? It looks like a peach. Have you ever taken, and I have, this goes back being on a farm one summer vacation when I was 10 with my grandmother, picking peaches, fresh peaches from an orchard. Have you ever done that? I learned something. You don't want to do it bare-armed in the hot, humid sun. All that wonderful, natural peach fuzz that they've hygienically or hermetically, whatever the word is, I'm forgetting the word for it, grown peaches now that they're not so fuzzy. But anyway, when you pick them fresh from the orchard and you get it all over you, it is the itchiest, messiest thing in the entire world. But let me tell you, those peaches taste the way God made peaches. They do not taste the way peaches from, you can say it, I won't say it from the platform, any of the grocery stores taste. Why? Because the implicit natural order, the God-given natural order of that peach requires a certain process of unfolding. Now look inside yourself and the changes, the significant changes in your life. Maybe you're going through a significant change right now. Change in your body, change in your finances, a change in your marriage, a change in how you're looking at your life. I bet there's a part of you that wants that change to be over, and you just want to be on the other side of that change as quickly as you possibly can. And you know what? It's okay to want that. In fact, I think that is very human to want that. However, your transformation is dependent upon your willingness to stay in that process and let the change unfold you in the way that it is designed to unfold you. To not be so quick to try to rush through the various stages, and we're going to talk about those in the next 3 weeks, to not be so quick to try to rush through those various stages that you don't actually experience the spiritual awakening, the deepening, the expansion, and the growing, that the change is the impetus to make happen. Bob uses in his book a metaphysical interpretation of an Old Testament story. It's actually one of my favorite Old Testament stories as well. It is the story of the journey of the Israelites out of captivity and slavery in Egypt into the Promised Land. And even as we describe that story, we often focus on just the two bookend pieces, the change on one hand of them finally being told by Pharaoh that they could be free, and then them in the promised land. What we forget, what most of us forget, is those two situations, those bookends, were separated by a significant period of time. Who remembers? 40 years. Say that a little louder. 40 years. Now, your transition is not going to take 40 years. I'm quite certain of it. I think you're a lot more aware than the Israelites might have been in their wandering and following Moses. But the point being that the impetus was their freedom, their stated given freedom from Egypt. It was not until they were in that journey experience, having to grow as a people, having to learn, having to let go of old ways of being. In fact, in the story, none of them that began the journey entered into the promised land. All of them had to die off, which is a powerful metaphysical teaching of the old ways have to die, and that takes some time. And being willing to be in that time. And so if you're like me, there may be a part of you that says, okay, but how long? Like, just tell me, God, how long? Because if you give me the end date, I know I can make it there. And sometimes maybe you'll get the end date, but I rather suspect that most often we won't. And this is where our faith comes in. This is where practicing everything that we are learning in unity comes in. This is where reaching out to each other and sharing some of our story and asking for help where we need help comes in. Because I believe that you and I are the same in many ways. I believe that you want to awaken spiritually. Am I right? And I believe that you want to stay as awake as you possibly can in all the dimensions and aspects of your life. I also believe that in your heart of hearts, that you know that the changes that are inevitable can lead you by choice and by practice and by trust into the transition and the transformation that your soul incarnated for to begin with. You are here in this life, as am I, in this time in history, with all that is happening in the world, and you are here in the families that you are, with those that you love and who love and adore you, as well as those that are royal sandpaper to your soul. You are here by divine appointment. There is something in your soul that is longing and craving to be birthed. And in order for that to happen, you must be willing to let some things die and must be willing to understand that the journey is a process. It isn't going to happen overnight. It's not going to take you 40 years, but it isn't going to happen overnight. Don't shortchange yourself the growth that is possible by trying to, what's the word I'm looking for? Speed up, accelerate is the word I'm looking for. Accelerate the experience. Don't mess with Mother Nature. Don't mess with the divine nature within. Namaste.